Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And let me just add to Andrew's welcome to each of you for taking some time to join us again today for what is the fourth in a series of four special town halls that we've organized during this COVID crisis, just to really give us a chance to connect with our greater community and to provide some information to you about some of the initiatives that we're undertaking generally, and in particular, how we're responding to COVID. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and at the end of our presentation today, we will take questions. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them there, and we'll make sure that they are all addressed with our guest speaker at the end of the presentation. So far, we've heard, we had our first town hall was really an introduction into Opportunity International Canada's program portfolio. The second one was on digital financial services. And then we had a wonderful one on health initiatives in India. Today, we're going to hear from the Education Finance, Education Quality team. And microfinance is really all about financial inclusion and training to help people work themselves out of poverty through sustainable livelihoods and education. And education has been a part of the ecosystem from the beginning, because parents who start microenterprises, when they start to earn income from that, one of the first things they do is make sure their kids get into school. Now, if there doesn't happen to be a school in their neighborhood or a quality school in the neighborhood, that presents a real challenge. And I think early on, a couple of clients borrowed a microloan to actually start a school. And that began what today has evolved in an unbelievable leverage of the power of microfinance to address significant gaps in education. Our guest today is Andrew McCusker, and he's the head of Education Finance at Opportunity International. The Education Finance program works with financial institutions in 22 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to invest more capital into the education sector and increase school quality. It has almost 13,000 schools currently borrowing to invest in school infrastructure like classrooms, washrooms, and dormitories. Prior to joining Opportunity, Andrew served in the corporate finance team for Bridge International Academies, working with over 500 low-cost schools across Africa and Asia. Splitting time between London and Nairobi, Kenya, he worked with both investors and education providers, helping to conduct financial impact analyses of key business decisions for these schools and lift education standards. He began his career at Goldman Sachs, serving as Executive Director of Global Investment Research, where he managed relationships with investors and built an international team working in a number of low-cost markets. Andrew brings a diverse skill set to the EduFinance team, including fundraising, finance, education, operations analysis, capacity building, performance reporting, and team management. Originally from Australia, he holds a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Melbourne and is a chartered financial analyst. He currently lives in London. It's certainly been my pleasure to become acquainted with Andrew. I met him just in the early days of starting as CEO, and we're just delighted to be a partner with this amazing global program. So without further ado, Andrew, I'd just like to hand the microphone and the screen over to you and share with us what Education Finance, EduQuality is all about, and also how you're dealing with this emerging COVID pandemic. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dan, and thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for taking the time out to kind of hear about our program, the Global Education Challenge, and how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted not just the education issues, but the work that we're trying to do in the low-cost markets that we serve. I may have met some of you before. I suspect I have. I suspect there's a few new faces as well. As Dan mentioned, my name's Andrew. I am the head of the Education Finance program here at Opportunity International. I'm dialing in from my living room in London, which is a bit of a shoebox. I guess we're all getting used to working from home and the nuances of that. What I thought I would do today is spend a little bit of time giving a bit of an introduction into the Education Finance program, talk a little bit about the types of schools that we're working with, including a few that I recently visited before lockdowns happened. Speak a little bit about COVID-19, the impact on the global education issues and how we're responding, and then how we're looking through kind of the short-term impacts of COVID-19 and how we're looking to respond from a program perspective when the restrictions of school closures are lifted. So I've put together a few slides which I'm happy to share with you. What I'll do is I'll drop in and out of slides through the presentation, which might seem a little bit clunky to you because I'm not great at using this thing, but let's see how we go. To give you a bit of an overview of the education finance business, we effectively exist to get more kids into better schools. Globally, there's about 6 out of 10 school-age kids that are currently either out of school or are in school and not learning. That number surprised me before I knew about it and joined this industry. Most of these kids don't sit in North America or the UK where I am or Australia where I'm from. A majority of these 6 out of 10 kids are sitting either in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia. And then there's a handful in Latin America and regions of Southeast Asia as well. There's effectively 2 issues here. You've got about 264 million kids that are out of school today. So they're kids that don't have a classroom to go to or are doing other stuff rather than sitting in class. In addition to that, you've got about 350 million kids that are sitting in classrooms, but they're not learning. So they're not learning basic literacy and numeracy skills. So there's kind of 2 problems here. There's an access issue, so kids not being in school, and a quality issue, so kids getting into the classroom and then not learning when they're there. In the education finance program, we're looking to address both of those issues. As Dan mentioned, we work with local financial institutions to help them to invest more money into the education sector. Dan mentioned, I think, that the first loan happened to a school by accident, which is a true story. So about 12 years ago in Ghana, a financial institution there was lending to small businesses, and they happened to disperse a loan to a school for the school to build a new classroom. What's typical for the schools that we work in is that they start as single classroom operations where either an ex-teacher or an entrepreneur in the community will decide to open a school, and they'll start with 1 classroom, usually like a class of nursery grade kids, enroll that cohort of kids, and then as that cohort graduates to the next year, they'll build another class and add a new teacher and then repeat that cycle over and over, and then all of a sudden have a large school. Effectively, what we're trying to do is take the learnings from that one financial institution in Ghana about 12 years ago and the lessons that they learned about how to effectively lend money to a school, and take that to more financial institutions around the world in more of these countries that have either a lot of kids out of school and a lot of kids that are in school and not learning. Ideally, the goal there is to increase the supply of classroom seats so that we have more opportunities for more kids to sit in school. Secondly, we work with those financial institutions or lenders to help them to lend money to parents and guardians to pay for school fees when a family has lumpy or seasonal household income and can't afford to pay school fees at that time. What we find in a lot of the markets where there's an access issue to education is that parents are having a large number of kids in each family. It's not uncommon in our biggest markets for families to have 5 or 6 kids on average. And so what happens is that at the start of school term, if they're due to pay 5 times school fees for 1 term in, say, January in Kenya, but crops aren't harvesting until, say, March or April, the financial institutions will provide a short-term loan to the parents so that they can pay the school fees and stop their kids from dropping out of school over that period. I mentioned a little bit about the second challenge being trying to improve the quality of education, where there's 350 million kids that are sitting in class today but not learning much. What we're doing is working with the school borrowers. So the borrowers that come around and borrow money from the financial institutions to build classrooms, to build dormitories, to build washrooms, and to buy assets like school buses. And we're helping those schools to increase the quality of learning that's happening in their schools by 1, taking their teachers through in-service teacher training, and 2, working with the leaders of the schools to go through the school development planning process to improve their schools and execute on those. I'm happy to circle back and answer any questions about the model as we go. In terms of what we've done to date, effectively what we're doing is taking these education lending products to more financial institutions in more countries to try to get more kids into better schools. Right now, we've worked with 54 financial institutions around the world in about 22 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. You can see there on the map that we have pockets in East Asia, a big and growing footprint in in East Africa, a big and growing footprint in West Africa. South Asia is a very large market for us. And then we have pockets where we work in Latin America, both in South America and Central America, and then some work in Southeast Asia as well. Dan mentioned that there's about 14,000 schools right now that are currently borrowing, and we have about 120,000 parents that are currently borrowing for school fees across these markets. In the history of the program over the last 12 years, we've managed to impact about 6.2 million kids, which is something I'm personally really proud of. And the way that we think about that is that's 6.2 million kids out of the total of 617 million kids that are either not in school or not learning today. Maybe what I'll do is take a step back and spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the types of schools that we work with. And I can draw on a trip that's actually very fond to me right now, and it was my last trip to Africa before the travel bans were imposed on us here in the UK and in a bunch of the markets that we work in. So in late January this year, I visited a few of our financial institution partners and prospective partners, and had probably one of my best days in my 3 years at Opportunity so far, where I visited 3 types of schools in and around Kumasi, which is a city in northern Ghana. It was really interesting. I visited a high-end secondary private school, which when I show you some photos will not look dissimilar to some of the private schools that you might be used to seeing in Canada. I visited a public primary school, which will look very different to even probably the worst public school that you've ever been to in Canada. And I visited 2 of the schools that are receiving finance from our program and are involved in our education quality program. What I thought I could do is share with you some of the photos from those 3 different types of schools, just so you can see the differences in the education offerings in the markets that we're working in. And this is a pretty typical example. So you can see here, this is Mamponteng Primary School. This is a public primary school on the main road. What was really interesting about the hour that we spent at this school for me is how crowded the classrooms are. You can see on the right-hand side there, way too many kids, very little control that any teacher is having over that class. And the photo on the left, a real lack of learning materials for the pupils in the class. This is pretty typical of what we see in primary school classes, public primary school classes across a bunch of the markets that we work in, where we have way too many kids per class, where there's not effective learning happening. And largely that's driven by high fertility rates. So in a lot of countries we work in, parents have a large number of kids per family. And what that means is there's a big school age population, and governments just can't keep up and build classrooms fast enough to get class sizes down. You can see here the second school that we went to visit this day was called Our Lady of Grace High School. This is definitely the best private school that I've ever been to. This is not involved in our program, but it shows you, it does a pretty good job of demonstrating what the very top notch of schools in Ghana look like. You can see there, it's probably similar to, or relatively similar to some of the private schools that you see in Canada. And thirdly, a couple of the schools that are involved in our program. So the Solid Rock Foundation School is the school there on the left-hand side, and Levite School is a school there on the right-hand side. What the types of schools that we fund are very low fee private schools. And so the average fees for the schools that we work with are around about 10 Canadian dollars per kid per month. That compares to public schools, which will have no fees, but some ancillary costs. The reason that we choose to work with the low fee school sector as a way to trying to get more kids into better school is that it's a financially sustainable business model. So entrepreneurs in these communities can charge parents about 10 Canadian dollars a month, have class sizes, as you can see in these photos, of between 20 and 35 on average. Kids have a chance to learn something, teachers are qualified, and kids have learning materials. What we find is that funding these schools, working with them to improve quality over time, allows us to have a financially sustainable model. And the reason that's important is it allows us to get a large amount of leverage on donor capital. So we can take a small amount of donor capital, work with financial institutions that will invest a lot more money to effectively increase the supply and demand of schooling in this subset of schools. Ultimately, the goal is to get more of those 617 million kids into better schools. You can see here, there's a great article in The Economist, which is a couple of years old now, but it's worth digging up for those that are interested in these schools. The thing that really surprised me here is that kids in low-income markets are about twice as likely to go to a private school than kids in either middle-income or high-income markets. And the reason is pretty simple, in that public schools are just way too crowded, and the chances of kids learning are not really high. What we find is that in really low-income markets, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the slide, is that in really low-income markets, parents are more likely to spend a larger share of their household budget on education than we are in high-income markets. And that's largely because they see it as a gateway out of poverty. And that's effectively the market which we're trying to increase the supply of schooling. So there's more opportunities for parents to send their kids to these schools. I thought it might be worthwhile, given the time of this call, to touch base a little bit on the impacts of COVID-19, not just on the education market globally, but on the markets that we're working with and how we're looking to respond to that. I think this chart does a pretty good job of explaining the secondary impact or the educational impact of COVID-19, which has been massively devastating for us. You can see here in purple the countries in the world where there's full school closures, and in purple or pink, in pink, the schools where there's localized school closures. Right now, it's about 90% of schools globally are closed as a result of COVID-19 and lockdowns that have been imposed. In every single country that we work in, all 22 of them, schools have been closed, which is pretty devastating. This has impacts on everyone across the value chain. Most importantly for the learners or the pupils at the schools. Being out of school has a couple of impacts. Unlike in Canada or the UK or Australia, distance learning or remote learning via internet, laptop, smartphone is not an option. Most of the parents in the communities that we work don't have access to smartphones, and the cost of data is prohibitive to having video teaching like we enjoy here in the UK, and I suspect you guys do in Canada. The second big issue that we see in a lot of our markets from this is over the last 2 decades, as an industry, we've done really, really good job of getting a lot more kids into the classroom. The thing that we learned through the Ebola crisis in West Africa, and the thing that I'm personally most concerned about all of this, is the risk that we lose kids from the education sector for good. My biggest fear is that kids that are sitting out of the classroom lose the momentum in learning, find other things to do with their time. For example, help generate family income or income for the family, particularly at a time where household incomes are probably coming down for a bunch of the beneficiaries that we work in. It's while we're all in lockdown, it's going to be pretty challenging for people that have market stalls, for example, to be generating revenue. The second biggest impact of all of this on the education sector, and probably the group that I feel equally sympathetic for right now, is the teachers. It's really challenging right now for schools to be paying teachers and to keep their whole workforce on while the schools are not receiving any revenue. And what that means is that we run the risk if school closures are prolonged, that we're going to lose some of these teachers from the system forever as they go and find other employment and sources of income. Thirdly, on school leaders, so the entrepreneurs that have started these businesses are all of a sudden receiving no fee income or revenue from their pupils because schools aren't operating. And as a result, are really struggling to pay their fixed costs, their teachers, their rent costs, their utilities, and any capital improvement costs. And fourthly, for the financial institutions that we work with that are suddenly not able to receive loan repayments from not just their borrowing clients in the education sector, but in a bunch of other sectors as well, and the pressure that that's putting on their business models right now. One of the great things that's come of this in the last few weeks, and one of the things that's really surprised me, is we've been looking for ways that we can help guide the school leaders through this crisis. And one of the things that we tried, probably not thinking that it would work that well, is to create Facebook groups for all of the school leaders and teachers in countries where we're posting country-specific content to help the school leaders and teachers to do two things: to help them to manage their businesses through the crisis, and help them to provide tips on how they can be engaging learners and digitally teaching kids remotely while they're outside of the classroom. We have been really, really surprised by the response that we've had from the school community through these pages. And probably one thing that we didn't realise was that the users of these groups would use this as effectively a way to create community and post questions to their community and get case studies and ideas from other schools about things that they're doing to either help them preserve their business or help them to engage pupils through this time. This is a screenshot from a couple of days ago, but in Uganda this morning, we had about 180 people on the page, which is really awesome for markets where people are on feature phones, which is like a downgraded version of a smartphone, and using what's called Facebook Live, which is Facebook without videos and things like that, and the content that we would think is engaging. On the financing side, we're working with our financial institution partners to help them to, one, assess the risk to their liquidity from prolonged school closures, and to manage for those. The financial institutions that we work with are largely right now working with the school borrowers to offer loan repayment holidays to the schools while they're closed. And what that means is that schools don't have to worry about paying loans, so they can, any cash flow that they've got or any cash reserves that they've got, can use to retain their teacher workforce and pay their other costs like their rent and other utility or other fixed costs. It's interesting talking through financial institutions. We weren't sure how they would react. Over the last couple of weeks, we've spoken to, I think about 28 of our 54 partners, and most of them are interested in offering these loan moratoriums to their school borrowers, which is really interesting. On the positive side for the financial institutions, we've seen a couple that have been pretty quick to launch new products through this. So what some of them are doing is launching working capital loans to the school borrowers. And that allows the schools to borrow money now to retain their teachers, to pay their utilities and do other things, which they can repay back once schools reopen. This is really great because it'll make sure that these schools are operating and ready to operate as soon as government restrictions are lifted. What I thought I'd do is just spend a couple of minutes rounding out how we're thinking about the education finance program over the next 3 years in terms of what we're looking to achieve. And then what I'll do is maybe hand back to Dan and Andrew to monitor the Q&A session. So in terms of education finance, really what we're looking to do three things over the next 3 years. First one is to increase access to education at scale. And what we want to do is take this model of education lending, the financially sustainable model, and take it to more financial institutions in more of these countries that have either a lot of kids out of school or in school and not learning. Right now we work with 54 financial institutions. We think we can work with over 100 after 3 years. We're aiming to double our footprint now in the next 3 years. Secondly is the goal of trying to increase learning outcomes for kids. So not just make sure that kids are in school, but make sure that they're effectively learning when they're there. And we'll measure that through learning gains and child level learning outcomes in the schools that are participating in the education quality program. And the third goal of our program is to share what we know. So to share all of our knowledge base on successful education lending and the education quality program on how we can lift educational standards in our schools and help the schools to become more financially sustainable with everyone. We realise that we can't solve this 617 million kid issue alone. Even if we had all of the financial resource that we had and the biggest team, no restrictions on our labour force, there's no way that we could do it in the period of time that we would like it to be done. So unlike any kind of small business operating commercially that's very, very keen to not have competitors in the market, we really want to see more competitors doing this in our space so that we can ultimately get more kids into better school faster. We think that if we do this, we can get about 13 million kids into better quality schools. And that will be achieved by having a bit over 9,000 loans dispersed to schools. So the schools would use those loans to build classrooms, washrooms, dormitories, and to buy assets like school buses. We think we'll have about 1.5 million kids that will be that will be able to stop from dropping out of school through school fee loans by effectively providing capital to families for 3 or 4 months, so that kids aren't sitting on the sidelines of schools. And as I mentioned, we think we can get to about 100 education lenders across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where there's really the higher need. So with that, I think I'll stop there, and very happy to open to questions and answers.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. And we already have a few questions coming in. I'll start off with one though. You know, we have at OIC launched we call a COVID response fund. We're trying to raise funds just to manage through the short-term crisis of this. We realize we're going to have to adapt our program response for the more long-term post-COVID reality. But we're just trying to come alongside our implementing partners and key program partners and help them as generously as we're able to. And of course, we have education finance listed as one of the hopeful recipients of that as funds come in. Can you speak to how, you know, what are some of the sort of short-term immediate needs as you're trying to adapt to the reality right now?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dan. There's probably 3 things that we're really trying to focus on right now through COVID-19 to reduce the impact of child learning of all of this. The first one is to help the schools to survive and to help them retain their workforce. This is obviously really important to see the schools come out of COVID-19 school closures and bounce back as quickly as they can. The second thing that we're looking to do is ensure continuity of learning for kids while they're outside of the classroom, so that one, they continue to make learning gains, but secondly, and arguably more importantly, they continue to be engaged with schools and the school system, so we don't see massive school dropouts on the other side of this. And thirdly is on helping these schools to bounce back as quickly as they can when schools are able to resume. So what the pieces of work that we're doing there is adapting our teacher training content for a rapid teacher onboarding program, so that when schools have to recruit new staff, the teachers can be onboarded quickly and in the classroom as soon as they can. And to help the schools to re-attract their pupils back into the system when schools open, whenever that might be.
That's great. Well, you know, I know that there are people within our community that are very supportive of the education finance program, and we are putting some asks out for some generous gifts so that we can work with you guys and make sure those get to you as quickly as possible. Try and make a difference here. You know, I'm just impressed as you talked about how even the schools and the school directors are responding. You know, that's the interesting thing about working with entrepreneurs, is that they're problem solvers, right? So, you know, whether it's schools or just our typical entrepreneurs, yes, they're suffering in a crisis right now. We need to be there for them now. We need to be there for them afterwards. But they're also amazingly resilient and creative in their ability to adapt. So when we get through this and we're starting to help them restart, I know they're going to be energetic participants in that process, which is great. I do have a COVID related question here, and that's, do you have any sense how well families are physically capable of isolating as kids are out of school in some of these communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I speak obviously to our team pretty regularly right now. And last night was actually on a call with our head education specialist for Africa, whose name is Robinaza Wede. She's based in Kampala in Uganda. Her husband and her 6 children are now all home. And so her 6 children are all school age, at very different age groups, trying to study and continue learning at home, while her and her husband are trying to work. She has a role very similar to mine, managing people across a bunch of different countries. She spends a lot of time on the phone, on video conference, as does her husband, and then the 6 kids are all inside at the same time. It's the same challenges that we're facing, right? It's just that living conditions are very different, right? Even for very well educated people like those on my team. It's really challenging. And I think the great thing about Africa and their response is that they were so quick to shut borders. Even some countries, before they had a single case in their country, closed borders and enforced social isolation and distancing. Hopefully that means that there isn't the widespread outbreaks that we've seen here in Europe and you guys have seen in North America. But over the last week or so, we've started to see a pickup in cases. the reason that I think that's really worrying in a bunch of the markets that we work in is they just don't have the hospital system to respond to this. I have a friend that works in Sierra Leone, and he was saying that in their country, they have one ventilator.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, you know, the poor are disproportionately affected by this, both health-wise and economically, and, you know, we've got to do the best we can to be there for them. Another question still related to the pandemic, and that's, you know, it's a tough one, but how much time or ground do you anticipate has been lost in your program or will be, you know, maybe monthly by the pandemic?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's the thing that worries us most. The longer that this goes on for, the deeper the impact is going to be. We started seeing school closures in our markets. I believe Ghana was the first in around about late, or mid to late March. So we're already about a month into school closures. Our concern is that if this goes on for another 3 or 6 months in these markets, then we're incrementally going to lose more kids to the system. It's really challenging for us to estimate the impact of that. The good thing that we have, or the thing that we have on our side in most markets, is that school calendar is on a calendar year basis, give or take, which is different from the way you guys operate in North America and we operate here in Europe. What that means is that if we lose, say, a term or two at the start of the year, we've got the back half of the year to make up time. Whereas the most challenging thing, you know, in West Africa or Europe or North America is that the longer this goes on and the closer that it goes to exam time, kids are going to miss exams, and that becomes a real challenge for figuring out promotions and opportunities beyond that. I'm not sure what the case is in Canada. Have they cancelled exams yet, or are you still working through that?
Well, and it's changing. It depends on the province and also the level of education. I know I have a daughter finishing her last year at university, and everything has gone online, and exams have been replaced by essays, like timed essays and things like that. They're trying to adapt as best they can. You know, the public schools were shut down, and for a couple of weeks had nothing, and now they've moved into an online learning mode, which, you know, the parents on our staff team are trying to do their job at home and also be teachers for their kids. It's, you know, it is a bit crazy, but it's not looking like school is going to be resuming this school year, so it's going to be a mess. Yeah. A few questions kind of more related to the program itself. Oh, we got a COVID question here. Let's take that one again too, and then we'll get on to general program type questions. We got lots of time. Have you seen the different countries you work in respond differently to COVID-19? Like what works in Canada may not work in Uganda or Rwanda, for example?
Yeah, socially, no. So borders have been closed in the same way that they have for us. I think the difference is there's just not as much international travel that happens in a bunch of the markets that we work in, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now that's very different in South Asia, which have pretty busy airports if you've ever been to Delhi before. The other lockdowns are probably a little more strict than they are here in the UK in a lot of the markets. Our biggest market in Africa is Uganda, which has curfew at night time, so no one's allowed out onto the streets after dark. But school closures are pretty widespread. Like I think I showed that chart earlier, which is about 90% of schools globally are closed. So it doesn't matter if you're in Canada or the UK or Uganda. Kids are at home trying to learn. I think you mentioned that your daughter is managing to do her exams online with timed essays. That's just not an option for the kids in the markets that we work in.
Yeah, for sure. Question we have has to do with the kind of partnerships that you have in order to scale the program. You know, what kind of partners are you looking for? And the question was also, when you're looking for partners, is it strictly for the loan model, or does that also apply for the quality model?
Yeah, there's effectively 3 types of partners that our program has. The first one is the financial institutions that we work with. These are organizations that have financial institution licenses in the countries that have a lot of kids out of school or in school and not learning, and who are actually administering the lending. To date, we've worked with about 54 financial institutions, and we're looking to double that number. We spend a whole lot of our time trying to convince new financial institutions in new countries that lending money to schools and to parents for school fees makes business sense for them. And the way that we're able to do that is we're able to take the data that we've captured over the last 12 years and prove to them that in markets similar to the ones that they live and operate in, that you can make these products financially sustainable. Second type of partners are partners for our education quality program. They can bring incremental knowledge, so products to help either teachers or to help school leaders to do a better job of educating the kids that go to those schools. We work with, for example, an accredited teacher training organisation in South Africa that's helped us to develop the teacher training components of our program. And thirdly, other financial partners. So effectively our donors all around the world who are helping fund and support our program. Obviously, we can't do the work that we do without funding partners.
Great. Question here is, are the school's loans conditional on the quality of the education at the school?
Yeah, great question. I wish. So in most markets, certainly most markets in Africa, financial institutions are very interested in the ability of the school to repay the loan. They look primarily at financial and operating metrics, which are indicators of the ability of the school to repay. Where we've started to see financial institutions care about quality metrics is in South Asia. So in India and Pakistan, bigger markets, more competitive. And we're finding lenders there that are increasingly looking at quality metrics as an indication of ability to repay loans going forward. We love that model, and it provides an inherent incentive there for the schools to lift quality standards. We've thought, we get this question quite often, and I don't really have a good answer, but we've thought about restricting access to loans for schools only above a certain quality level. The challenge with that is we're going to exclude access to capital to a whole bunch of schools in really poor remote communities where they're like, relative to the schools that you or I went to, are quite frankly terrible schools, but they're the best schools that any parent has, or the best option that a parent in that community has got to send their kids. So what we'd rather do is provide them the access to capital to build out their facilities, and then work with them on the education quality program and start from wherever they are now, and help them to improve to something better over time.
Yeah, I love that. I think it parallels basically our modus operandi with individual entrepreneurs as well, right? It's financial inclusion and training. And ultimately, if you can help somebody run a more effective business, they're going to be better clients, they're going to make loan payments, are going to grow, and they're going to take larger loans. They might become SMEs and eventually hire their neighbors. So you have to invest in them, and there's no difference here. But if we were just say, no, we're only going to give loans to people that actually know how to run an effective business today, then there'd be a whole class of people that we wouldn't be helping on that journey towards either an education or a sustainable livelihood. So that's great. Can you speak to the ripple effect of the impact of a loan to a local school in the broader community?
Yeah, great question. The interesting thing about the education sector in the markets that we work in is it's massive. And it's massive because there's a large number of kids. Like the school age population in Uganda is about 45% of their total population. And that's because on average, parents are having 6 kids each. So what that means is that the education sector is a massive employer. What we find is that for every school loan that's dispersed, schools on average employ about 3.9 extra staff. In addition to that, there's around 7 construction workers that will work temporarily on building the classrooms, dormitories, and or washrooms. And on top of that, we find that there's about 8 community jobs that are created. So this is people that either supply foods to the schools in little tuck shops or little shops around the schools, are sewing uniforms, retailers or suppliers of textbooks and things like that, which is effectively the multiplier of what we're trying to do. The whole education finance model is about taking a small amount of donor or grant capital, helping financial institutions on the ground to launch these products, and getting massive leverage on that small amount of donor capital through incremental investment over and over as these financial institutions build a portfolio. So lend money to schools, get repayments, lend that money to schools, get repayments, and repeat that cycle over and over. To give you a bit of a sense, over the history of the program, for every $1 of donor funds that we've spent, has resulted in about $15.4 that's been invested into the education sector as a result of that. That's the reason that I choose to work in this program. I'm in this game to get as many of those 617 million kids into better quality school And the best way that I know how to do it is through a highly levered model that can do this.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly powerful, isn't it? It's astounding. I remember reading it when I first joined Opportunity Canada, and I was just blown away by it. It's the power of that. On the quality side, has it been operating long enough that you're starting to get some research into the the quality of the graduates coming out of the schools?
Yeah, great question. The short answer is no on the quality of the graduates coming out of the schools, being impacted by the quality program specifically. The Education Quality Program has been around for about 3 years. The program has effectively 2 goals: help kids to learn more when they're at school, and to help the schools to become more financially sustainable businesses. What we've been able to achieve over the last couple of years is that about 55% of the schools that are in that program have demonstrated improvements in school quality over those 2 years. We got that evidence in December last year, and that was the first time that we had evidence this program was working in a widespread way. In that the program was designed on effectively academic or theory of creating communities of practice, sharing best practice amongst each other, and this kind of self-sustaining cluster group model, kind of like the trust groups of historical microfinance. So the program's centered around this. The framework, which is developed, is called Pathways to Excellence, and that's effectively helping meet schools where they are and improve from that over time. We were really encouraged in December when we got that evidence. The next stage is to test for changes in teacher practices. Until we see that, it's unlikely that we're going to see changes in learning outcomes for kids. This is the journey that we're on. What we find is that there's a bunch of technologies out there that can be proven to increase learning outcomes for kids, like numeracy and literacy apps that you guys might see kids playing on in Canada. The challenge that we have in our markets, where parents have income of say $100 a month for 6 people, is that a tablet and data and app costs are effectively out of the question. So what we're trying to do to get most of the 617 million kids into school is working with financially sustainable models. So things that we know that if we walk away, they will continue to operate into the future, so that our impact is not just short term, but carries on.
That's great. Well, I think you already answered another question, which is what role does technology play in helping schools meet the goals? I think you touched on it. I don't know if you had any more to add on that.
Yeah, I think globally it can. It's going to be a while before it can play a meaningful role in the markets that we work in terms of doing something at scale. And the issue there is just technology cost relative to incomes of families. The rate at which new apps are being developed that can help kids to achieve learning gains is pretty incredible. There's a bunch of apps out there actually that have been proven to work in the markets that we work in. I would love to see tablet costs and data costs come down to the price point such that many more kids have access to this. We take reliance off the pressure off the school infrastructure. We take pressure off the teachers and the teaching stocks in the countries, and increase learning gains at the same time. That would be awesome. We're just not there yet, but it's pretty encouraging right now.
Very cool. Now, I think a couple more questions. One is, do all finance schools participate in the Education Quality Program? And is there evidence that the Education Quality Program has an impact on the financial risk side of things for the partner financial institution?
Yeah, great question. So we have about 14,000 schools that are currently borrowing from our financial institutions, of which about 1,700 of those are currently in our Education Quality Program. And so those schools are spread across 8 countries, across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It's interesting. What we found is that the schools that participate in that program do in fact have lower default rates on their lending than the schools that don't. And it kind of surprised us early days in this program when we weren't quite sure of what the impact of the program would be, particularly after we'd only been delivering it for say 6 or 12 months. In that changes in the institution or in the school level tend to take time to happen. But what we saw is that default rates on school lending dropped by about 240 basis points or 2.4%. And what that's meant is that financial institutions now have an incentive to pay or subsidise the cost of that program, which is really great news for us. What that does is takes the pressure off or our reliance of donor funding to fund 100% of the cost of that program, which means that we can take that program to more and more schools. We think the reason that happens is that the schools feel, one, the schools become better businesses because they're doing a better job of learning or teaching kids, and therefore are able to attract more pupils. The management of the schools are running their schools as better businesses, and therefore receiving higher cash flows and being able to pay back loans more readily. But thirdly, and I think probably the most importantly, is that the schools get benefit from the education quality program, and they realise that that's linked to the finance, and because of that, they want to preserve that and want to maintain that relation or a strong relationship with the financial institution, which I think is a great result.
Well, that's great. Well, I know we all hope that we can get through this current crisis and start the rebuilding process, whatever that even looks like, right across the work that Opportunity is doing in a number of countries. When we come out of this and we're back into rebuilding for the future, the question here is, what's the biggest opportunity for growth within the education finance project?
Yeah, so we think there's right now we work in 22 countries around the world. We think there's about 53 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that this model can work and can work at scale. And what we mean is they've got large population sizes, large percentage of school age population or high fertility rates, low learning outcomes for kids, generally overcrowded public schools, and some financial institutions or system that we can work with. So globally, we think there's about 53 countries that kind of meet that criteria. Our first goal, as soon as travel restrictions are lifted, to go and convince as many financial institutions as we can in the first 3 months to launch these products for the next school year. That will be effectively the number one objective across all 3 regions. We think that we've got a great amount of evidence now from our 22 countries that this thing works, and it's becoming incrementally easy for us to convince the marginal financial institution to do this. We had a whole bunch of momentum early this year in January. And so what we're trying to do in that we found about 16 financial institutions to build our pipeline of those to work with between now and September. We've effectively had to push that work back by 3 months right now. We'll see how much further we have to push it back by, but we're keen to get going as quickly as we can, as soon as we can get on the plane again.
Well, that's great. Well, I think that's the end of the questions. I'll kind of leave it open for another 30 seconds while we wrap here. But yeah, Andrew, I just want to thank you so much for making time available. I know it's late in the evening for you, and you probably had a crazy long day like all of us seem to have working from home. It hasn't been quiet with Zoom. It's been very busy, but we're all of us, our hearts are broken for our clients and our partners, and we're trying to be there as meaningfully as we can. One reason why Canada has launched the COVID Response Fund, we're looking for you to be as generous as possible. It's pretty much our main focus right now in terms of fundraising. We're very serious about coming alongside our partners, implementing partners in Latin America and also with the education finance team. Canada is deeply committed to supporting the global education finance programs, and we want to be strong partners into the future with that. But right now, we just need to come alongside and help, as generously as we can through this, what we call this crisis. It's kind of like help them survive now so that we can help them thrive later, as I think how my colleague Atul Tandon in the States put it. And it's maybe sustaining now and then, helping to rebuild later. And I know we're going to have to be smart and savvy, but we have great clients and partners to work with as well. So no more questions. So Andrew, thank you again. It's just been a pleasure being a co-panelist with you on this. Thanks for what you've shared. Any last comments before we sign off?
No, I'm just delighted to have the opportunity. I think it's great that so many of you would take the time out, particularly with everything else going on in the world, to quite frankly care about kids that are in a lot worse position than we all are. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you when we organize our next town hall. And Andrew, have a great night.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Bye and God bless.